about the world that are statements like race is an important aspect of individual and group identity. This implies how important race itself is as a is something which you should care about. You should be very aware of and care about your race. Other people do. Different races build different societies that reflect their natures. So we have an idea that there's something almost inherent about race. That affects the type of society. American society was built by white people, is the implication here. And white people built a society that reflects white nature. That's the idea. Now, if you look at whites or people of any other race, it's normal for them to want to be the majority. Every group wants to be to create a society on the basis of their own nature, right? So they want to live in a society dominated by their own people. There's an essentializing quality here, in the sense of the society is, your race is your essence, I think. That's the idea. We go to the next part of it. We see that we have an argument in favor of whites, which fills in on the previous point, that whites will lose their civilization and their heritage if they allow non-whites to become the majority. And other groups, non-whites, for example, know this. Whites don't. Look at the end there. Whites don't know this. But here, whites take it for granted, right? All the groups take it for granted that they can defend their own interests. So you have this idea of implied here, without being stated, but implied here. There's a sense that each person is defined by their race. They belong to a group because of their race. Each group functions autonomously from other groups. Each group is its own sort of, almost like a team. Each group is like a team. Each race is like a team. And these teams compete. And whites are not competing. That's the idea. Now, this leads to this idea, right? Ethnic cleansing is crucial. If we don't get rid of, that's implied here. If whites allow themselves to become the minority, well, how can whites not allow themselves to become the minority? Since the one way would be to have lots of children, right? Whites should have lots of children. Another way, and that's not a realistic way, is to reduce the populations of non-whites. And there's only one way to do that, right? Is to eliminate them. And it doesn't say how you're going to eliminate them. Maybe you would deport them. Maybe you would have to, if you couldn't find a place to deport them, then you end up in a Nazi scenario. That's implied in there, but it's never stated. What you need to concentrate on when we go back here and look at this is sort of the calmness of which the way these ideas are being expressed. Rationally, calmly, sort of reasonably. This is something you could sort of just have a kind of academic, it could be like an academic argument, the way it's expressed. But the ideas are not at all. Let's go over it here. Racism is reasonable and logical. In the good old days, everybody knew this before the 1960s. 60s, what happened with the civil rights, and also the hippies and the anti-war demonstrations and the counterculture. America went decline in the 1960s is the idea. After all, right, this was understood. We are defined in terms of our race. That's the idea. Races are like teams. Different races are fundamentally different and incompatible. Each race wants to set up their own society in their own way. Ethnic cleansing, therefore, becomes necessary and is inevitable. Ethnic cleansing, and it doesn't say how this is done, doesn't propose any way, but you can imagine the only ways it could be proposed is through a huge amount of violence. If we don't do it, right, we don't want this violence, but it's inevitable, because if we don't do it, they'll do it to us. Compare this to the typical, what we think of as the stereotypical supporters of these types of white supremacist ideas. Here they are. They're Nazi flags, this kind of craziness, the way they look, right? Violence, stridency. Stridency means sort of screaming. Other efforts to intimidate, right? And there's these references to historical genocide right here. It's not subtle in this picture. And fascism also, right? No democracy. Nazis were not Democrats, even to other Germans. So different. Here we have no stridency. We have educated language, full sentences. You wouldn't expect full sentences out of these people. And you have rational argumentation from premises to consequences, right? The argumentation is very rational, right? Every step followed from another. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, how can you say these things are rational? Let's look at this, right? But first, before we go on to explaining why they're rational, we want to go on here. Different forms, but different conclusions, all right? But the conclusions are identical. You end up with these people, and this group and this group end up with the same results. How can it be rational? How can American Renaissance, that's this organization here, right? American Renaissance. How can American Renaissance be rational? And I'm not defending these ideas. I think that they're indefensible. But you have to understand that when you're doing this type of research, you can't just, you have to attack it for what's wrong with it. It's not enough to say it's wrong because the ideas are bad. The ideas are bad. But to do an analysis of it, we must understand where the ideas are bad, where it falls apart. And this is in the premises. That's the assumptions at the beginning. The assumptions, for example, that races are like teams. Races are like teams. I mean, that's kind of crazy. Your race is very important. Well, it might have a certain importance in terms of your culture, but it's not like you can't make friends with people from other races. Sometimes your best friend, sometimes your spouse, sometimes other members of your family. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So it's the premises. This understanding, which is typical of fascism, is that your group identity, in this case your race, is more important than your individual identity. There's no room for an individual in this. Also, there's no necessary connection between one's race and one's culture. Even if you could define race, and race is very hard to define because it's not really biological, it's culture. It's defined by culture in the sense that what we think of as white today is not necessarily what we thought of as white, 19th century. There's books about how the Jews became white, how the Irish became white, because in the 19th century they weren't thought of necessarily as white. Other work might be how we define African Americans here, blacks. If we define someone as black, well, it's not clear. Some people who 50 years ago would be thought of as black, who define themselves as black, with one black parent, one white parent, they might have been just completely thought of as black. Now they might be thinking of themselves as black, but they might think of themselves as half white, half black. So what someone's race is not necessarily clear. And although the argumentation, if the premises that they stated were true, they came up with a realistic argument. But since the premises are patently absurd, they're indefensible, the argument itself it doesn't matter how rational it is. So a discourse analysis, this is a very easy case, a critical discourse analyst would be able to uncover the hidden meanings and expose the supposedly intellectual discourse, such as this, as somewhat fraudulent. It's not real. Now, I've done work in a different area of discourse analysis. My work is in genre analysis. Genre analysis looks